Here, Gilbert is Professor of Development Studies and International Relations in SOAS, and Gilbert published many books, many of them translated into 15 languages, and his recent book, I think, is the topic of his talk today. It is Morbid Symptoms, Relapse in the Arab Uprising. He's going to talk about the revolutionary process in the Middle East and North Africa. So he's going to talk about continents, and then, as usual, we have a break, and after that we can have our questions and discussions.
Thank you, Bülent, and thank you for the invitation. Thanks to the organizers and to Bülent especially. Well, a nice opportunity to meet everybody here, and maybe even we'll make better acquaintance later in the discussion. After, I should add to what Bülent said, that I belong to the region, which is not a minor issue here. So I'm from Lebanon, actually. Yeah. And I'm here in the UK only since 2007. Doesn't mean that before that I was in Lebanon. I left Lebanon in 1983, but I grew up and spent my formative years in Lebanon. Okay, so we'll be speaking indeed about the revolutionary process, which is something that I analyzed in two books. The one Bülent mentioned is a sequel to a previous one, which is the main one in terms of analyzing this topic, the revolutionary process in the Middle East and North Africa. The book is titled "The People Want: A Radical Exploration of the Arab Uprising." It came out in Turkish, by the way, as most of my books in Turkish translation. So this is the main, that's where I provide the main analysis for that. And then that came out in 2013. It analyzed what was called the Arab Spring. And then 3 years after that, 2016, I published a sequel to the previous book entitled Morbid Symptoms, the one that Bülent mentioned, which is focused on analyzing the period that started in 2013, which I characterize as a period of backlash, counter-revolution. And the full title is Morbid Symptoms, Relapse in the Arab Uprising. So it's a kind of medical metaphor to the fact that we had a relapse in the old system coming back, even with a vengeance in many cases. So it's an ongoing analysis, and since I'm speaking of writing, for anyone interested, I can refer you to the latest piece I wrote about that, which is freely available on the Monde Diplomatique side and the Nation, the Nation. On both websites you can find it. It's, if I remember, the title is the Seasons After the Arab Spring or something like this. You can find there. It's a long article. It's an article, but updating the analysis in the light of the two major ongoing episodes of this big upheaval, which are, as you know, in Sudan and Algeria. Started in last December. It started in Sudan, and then in February Algeria joined this movement. They were the 7th and 8th countries to see major uprisings, major upheavals since 2011. Since actually, we should say since December 2010, because that's when it started in Tunisia. very end of 2010. It started, of course, the major event, which was the downfall of the dictator, happened in January 2011, and then you had an amazing illustration of the domino theory, because one after the other, a number of states of the region, all belonging to the same Arab-speaking set of states, went into full uprising mode. So you had started Tunisia, then Egypt was the next, and that boosted the movement, and then Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, 6 states, 6 countries with these major uprisings, and practically not a single country in the region, from the Atlantic coast to the Gulf, not a single country did not see a major upsurge in the social movement, a very important upsurge in social movement. In 6 countries that reached the level of an uprising, but in all countries you had a major rise in the social movement, with the exception of extremely artificial states like the UAE and Qatar, which are states where only 10% of the population are nationals and 90% are expatriates, migrants. These are not states where anyone would dare start something, given that also the composition of the migrant community, which is from many countries, and a lot of them coming from South Asia. But that's another topic. So the key point is that we had a really revolutionary shockwave in 2011, which remained ongoing. Let's say the social tension, the next year, 2012. But in 2013, we had a beginning of a setback. There was a first one, but it was isolated. It was a special case, again, in the Gulf, another Gulf country, Bahrain, in 2011. Early on, the uprising there was repressed and deterred, basically by also by intervention of neighboring Gulf monarchies to rescue the Bahraini monarchy. But given the fact that Bahrain is a marginal state, that remained marginal impact. Much more important was in 2013, Iran's intervention in Syria on the side of the regime, which allowed the regime to go on a major offensive and regain some of the ground that the regime had lost in the previous year. And that signaled a counter effect, if you want. So we had a domino-style revolutionary campaign in 2011. Then in 2013 we have the reverse. After Syria, you had the coup in Egypt in 2013, in July 2013. Then soon after, the return of the old regime men in Tunisia, albeit there while preserving the democratic gains of the uprising, unlike Egypt, where the situation turned very repressive. And then countries like Libya and Yemen fell into civil war. So that, as a whole, represented a setback, a big setback for the movement, for this impetus that started in 2011. Now, when we rethink of the mainstream comments, especially Western, in the West and in Europe, in the United States, comments on all that, you had a lot of, in the beginning of 2011, reconsideration of the classical stereotyping of the region, what we call Orientalist after Edward Said. The idea that, well, Muslim people are not prepared for democracy because of their culture, such kind of explanations. And then you had this major shockwave, this huge revolutionary wave engulfing the whole region, the whole Arab world practically. And then you had a lot of people saying, wow, well, after all, they are like us. You know? They are also longing for democracy and freedom and all that. And there was a tendency to project on what was happening in the region some of the democratization transitions that we had in several parts of the world. Southern Europe in the 70s, Latin America in the 80s, and also East Asia, especially South Korea and Taiwan, some parts of other parts of Africa and Asia, and then Eastern Europe, the fall of the system of states that was dominated by the Soviet Union. So there was a tendency to project these events on what was happening in the Arab world, and hence also this phrase, the Arab Spring, which was based on the expectation of a smooth, relatively peaceful and rapid transition to democracy, as had happened basically more or less in the cases that I mentioned, the historical cases, in this so-called wave of democratization that from the 70s onward. Then, of course, when you had the setbacks before that, the stereotype came back with a even stronger. You see, they can't. That's finished. That's dead. And a lot of people just regarded this whole spring as something that was some kind of eruption, but ephemeral one, and that was over. And here we are again now with new movements in two other countries, which are still ongoing and struggling. And this actually confirms that what started in 2011 was not, I mean, on the one hand, it was not, and that could be said from the beginning, it was not going to be a rapid and smooth transition. But also, it's now confirmed that it's not dead, and in that sense, what is confirmed is the view that what started in 2011 was actually a long-term revolutionary process, like we have had so many in history. When you think of English Revolution, you think of the French Revolution, you think of Chinese Revolution, whatever major revolutionary process, you see that it went on for decades, we are here speaking not of a single country, like in the cases that I mentioned, but of a region. And, I mean, if you look in terms of region, maybe the comparison should be more to the Western European transformation, which went over a few centuries actually. Well, of course, history accelerated since then. More than, closer to that than just to a single country processes. But anyhow, the key point here is that there was a deep flow in most commentaries in 2011, which was to believe that it was only a matter of democratization. and to compare that to a lot of countries where you had democratization processes, that is, shift from dictatorship to parliamentary democracy, liberal democracy. Well, you have two major flows in the reasoning. One is when the comparison is those countries that I mentioned earlier, which are all countries where you had modernization, industrialization, big steps in that direction, and therefore the transition to democracy came as a kind of crowning of a kind of political adaptation of the political regime to the modernized social economic structures. So this is democratization coming on top of fast development, actually, period of intensified, accelerated development. Then the other set of countries, Eastern Europe, there it was not a result of fast development. On the contrary, it was a result of some stagnation of the Eastern European economies for a number of years before they crumbled, the state crumbled. And what crumbled is the whole system. It wasn't just a democratization. It was a shift from state-dominated economies to market economies. It was therefore it was an economic, social, and political shift. But it happened faster and in a smoother manner than even the transitions to democracy, the pure transitions to democracy that I mentioned. But to believe that that was a kind of normal sequence was wrong, because what was this, what enabled this very rapid and apparently easy transition in Eastern Europe was the fact that these were not countries ruled by property owners, property classes. These were countries ruled by bureaucrats, mainly, basically. And they had no major incentive beyond maybe the very small group at the summit. They had no major incentive to fight very hard in defense of the regime against a big mass movement. And that's how these regimes, well, collapsed very quickly. It was a big surprise for many, especially Western political commentators who for decades have said that this is irreversible kind of totalitarianism. All these theories were proved quite wrong at that time. Now, the Arab world falls in the category of Eastern Europe in the sense that, in only one formal sense, that the explosion came not as a result of accelerated development and modernization, but as a result of this being blocked, the blockage of this development. It was a result of a development blockage, which we can see when we analyze the figures, and we see that the Arab states, the Middle East and North Africa, has had very low rates of growth for a few decades, since the 80s. Very lower growth rates than other parts of Asia and Africa, even lower growth rates than sub-Saharan Africa, although the MENA region has more riches thanks to the oil and gas. There's a huge concentration there. And much lower growth rates than, of course, East Asia, that is China, and especially China, and South Asia, India. Even compared to these regions, the growth rates were much lower, whereas the demography was quite had a quite high rate, which meant that the growth per capita, the income per capita, was almost stagnating or very slowly developing, far from enough to absorb those coming to the labor force. And that's how the region, for several, even for many years, has had and still has the highest rates of unemployment, especially youth unemployment. The highest rates of youth unemployment in the world are in this part of the world. And so there we understand that that's the real root of the explosion. Now, of course, some places start on social issues, and others on political issues, but the fuel, if you want, the basic fuel of this big explosion is the social economic crisis, this deep social economic crisis. And that meant, from here you understand, that it could not only be solved by democratization, by a new constitution and free elections. That would not solve the problem. That would be a gain for the mass movement, okay, no doubt about that, but that would not be enough to end the turmoil. That would not be enough to solve the key problems. What is needed in the region is a deep structural change of the social, economic, and political structures. Very deep change of all that. And that's one point. Now the second point is that unlike Eastern Europe, this region is not ruled by bureaucrats, but by property classes. And even more than property classes, it's a region where you still have a number of states which are what we call in the jargon patrimonial, which are states which are literally owned by ruling families. The ruling families that consider the state as their private ownership. They can do whatever they want with the state budget, they can do whatever they want with the state income, they regard the armed forces, the elite sections of the armed forces as their private guard, their Praetorian guard. So they consider the state as just their property. And that's the case of all the monarchies. We have 8 monarchies in the Arab countries. And some of the so-called republics, Syria of Assad, or Libya of the Gaddafi, or Iraq of the Saddam Hussein time, were also states where the family of the president, because they were supposed to be republics, just appropriated the whole state, and reshaped the whole state, the whole security and armed forces in order to control them and to ensure their loyalty to the person, of the ruler and the family. So you have the family, then the tribal and other enlarged family links, and then sectarian or regionalist or whatever links used in order to do that. So that would mean, when one understands what's happening, that it was never going to be smooth and rapid. It was going to take a very long time, which is probably several decades. Of course, several decades of turmoil, revolution, counter-revolution, upsurge, backlash, and all that, like any revolutionary processes. And of course, the outcome of all that is not given, pre-given, or it's not written in the sky. So it's an open process. Either the only thing we can say is that if there is no radical change of the structures that, as I mentioned, then the alternative to that is more and more tragedies, more and more chaos, more and more turmoil, as the region has been seeing in recent years. So that's why I was stressing the point from the beginning that the term Arab Spring at that time was based on illusions, and that people should have understood that this is a long-term evolutionary process and that it won't be easy. You can't peacefully overthrow regimes like those that you have in the region. That's not Eastern Europe. They are entrenched, very deeply entrenched interests there, which will not hesitate to resort to force, the whole spectrum of force, in order to defend their privileges and stick to power. Now, where we see a confirmation also of the analysis is the fact that although we could distinguish from 2011 between the two first years of, let's say, upsurge, then after 2013, a backlash, a setback, a period of counter-revolutionary setback, until now we have, at least in two countries, a new upsurge. But beyond all that, what did not stop and did not change is the social turmoil. So during all these years, since 2011, we have had local and national social revolts, upsurges. In Tunisia, there has been several. In Morocco, a social movement carried on through waves. In Sudan, you had also waves of social struggle. One important one 6 years ago, 2013. In Jordan, in Iraq. So everywhere it kept boiling. The social situation kept boiling. And that was the best, if you want, illustration of the fact that the real root, the real engines, if you want, of this big upheaval is in the social economic crisis. As I said, also from that perspective, you could expect new upsurges to come. That is, it's a long-term evolutionary process, so inevitably you'll have new phases of, and that I was saying that over all the previous years after 2013, that there will be new springs or new upsurges. And that happened. That happened, as we can see now, with two countries, two major countries in the region, Sudan and Nigeria. And actually, whether they spread or not to the rest of the region will depend on what results they achieve. Because what led to the first wave was the victories, first in Tunisia and then in Egypt in removing the president, that encouraged other countries to join the fray. And now people are watching the region, watching Algeria, watching Sudan, and seeing how it goes there. And that not only the people are watching that, but the rulers of the region are watching that. That's why also they are supporting the counter-revolution in both countries, in Sudan and Algeria, very much so. Before also getting to some comment on what's going on now, let me also make a distinction between the categories of state. I described one of them, the patrimonial state. As I said, this is the case of the 8 monarchies and a few so-called republics that turned into monarchy-like regimes. One at least lived, or at least in one case you had what would have happened in Libya had Gaddafi died of normal, natural death, like Assad or Saddam Hussein, had he died of natural death, also like Assad, they would have been succeeded by their sons. Absolutely no doubt about it. Everything was prepared for that. So they had turned into also monarchy-like regimes. Now, beyond this, we have other regimes in the region which are not fully patrimonial, which are not fully modern, which are what is called neo-patrimonial, that is somewhere between, which means that there are states where you have a certain degree of bureaucratization and institutionalization, but a lot of nepotism, cronism, various forms of exploitation of the state resources by the rulers. With the exception that the rulers don't own the state, they can't transmit power to their sons, like in the rest. Who makes the king or the president is some institution, not the king actually, because that doesn't apply to monarchies. So who makes the president is an institution. And in 3 countries of the region, this institution is the army. And these countries are Egypt, Sudan, and Algeria. These are the 3 countries which are like what Turkey was before the relative, civilian transformation of power under the AKP. Previously the army was the kingmaker, the president maker, if you want, as you know, in Turkey. And that's what you have at a higher degree in the 3 countries that I mentioned. With even a peak in Egypt, where the army is even the major economic sector of the country that has developed under Sadat and then Mubarak, and you have a kind of hypertrophied military sector completely dominating the country. Now, in those countries, the president was not the owner of the state, he was a product of the army, he was the chief of the army, but the army could change its chief when the chief failed. And that's why when Mubarak became completely discredited, the army removed Mubarak. It's a coup that we had in Egypt in 2011. It's true that you had a big mass movement and all that, but those who removed the president were the army and came to the TV, the very classical scenario of coup d'etat. You have a military guy coming to television and reading communique number 1 and then communique number 2, and you have a junta, the military council, that seizes power. This is exactly what happened in Sudan and Algeria. It started on different issues. In Sudan, it started on the prices of bread, austerity measures. IMF inspired austerity measures, triggering mass revolt, and then this time it took massive proportions in Sudan and became a major uprising, similar to what you had in Egypt, that is, people gathered in one central square in Khartoum, like you had in Tahrir Square in Cairo, and that resembled this a lot. Algeria, the movement started in February on a political issue, the attempt to give a 5th mandate to a president who was already on a wheelchair and half paralyzed mentally for several years. This is what triggered the movement. But again, whatever the trigger is, the causes, the deep causes are the same. All these countries have the same social economic blockage, the same social economic problems, and massive unemployment, youth unemployment, and all that, and that's the key ingredient behind this big explosion. Now, in both countries, the scenario, the Egyptian scenario, what was there? I mean, in Algeria, it's not a permanent occupation, but waves of demonstrations, but the result is the same. faced with this big mass mobilization, the army in both cases did like the Egyptian army. They removed the president. So Bouteflika was removed, the Algerian president. Omar al-Bashir was removed, the Sudanese president. And the army is basically, officially, very clearly in Sudan, unofficially, but de facto, clearly running the country directly. That is, in Algeria, even if you have some so-called interim president and all that, it's the chief of the army that sets the tune, and he decides. He's always, now all the time on television for political issues which are not usual for any head of army. So, now, when we do this, that means also that in those states like the three countries I mentioned, plus countries where it wasn't the military but the state bureaucracy, you could have a removal of the president in the face of a mass movement. That is, the state could get rid of the president to preserve the regime, the state, to preserve their interest. This cannot happen in those regimes which are owned by ruling families. And we have seen Libya and Syria, it turned very, I would say, naturally into civil war. It could have also turned into civil war in Bahrain had you had not an intervention of the monarchies of the Gulf monarchies, the other Gulf monarchies. Because these states are states where, I mean, you can't conceive the state getting rid of the ruler. Because the ruler, the ruling family controls the state completely. The key armed security apparatus are led by members of the family of the ruler and all that, which you didn't have it in Egypt. Mubarak's son, for instance, was a civilian, not even a military. He was a businessman. You don't have this in either Algeria or in Sudan or in Tunisia or others. That's why you could remove the president. But, as I said, the state was removing the president in order to preserve the core regime. In the other countries, you could not separate. I mean, if you take the metaphor, the comparison of the iceberg, and the tip of the iceberg and the deep state, if you want, that is below the surface. Some in the category of states where you have institutional continuity, they could remove the tip of the iceberg to preserve the iceberg. In the other category of states, you could not. They could not separate the tip from the mass, and therefore it would be either you manage to crush, to smash the whole, or it remains in power. It smashes you. But removing the tip of the iceberg, again, as you understand from the metaphor, is not a removal of the iceberg. And so, neither in Tunisia, nor in Egypt, nor anyway, that was the regime, the basic regime removed. As I said, Tunisia maintained a change in the political conditions of the regime, a democratization. That was the game, which was maintained for one reason, not the reason you'll find in the mass media and the big press and all that. The real reason is the only country where you have in the region where you have a powerful workers' movement. The only country with a powerful, organized labor union that is independent from the state. Unlike the other countries, most other countries where either the unions are very weak or they are completely controlled by the state. In Tunisia, traditionally the left wing has been invested in the union movement and played a key role, at least at the intermediary and grassroots level. The top leadership could be controlled by the state, but the state never managed to control the whole union. And that's, and of course now the union is completely autonomous vis-à-vis the state, and that's why democratic gains were maintained. But you have still the same people in power, you have still the same class in power, you have still the same economic policies. So the structures that I mentioned at the beginning have not been changed. They have not been changed anywhere. And the only case of a state completely collapsing is Libya because of the defeat. And it was an illustration that you couldn't topple Gaddafi while preserving the state. So when he was toppled, it was the whole state collapsing with him. But, you know, when the country 2 years after went into a civil war and it's in a chaotic state. So there hasn't been any qualitatively different kind of structure put in place. Now, Sudan and Algeria are coming into the picture now. And here we get to the last point that I want to comment upon, which is the issue of the leadership. One key weakness of the movement in general in 2011 was the issue of the leaderships. That is, with the exception of Tunisia, where you had the labor movement, which actually led the uprising and managed to lead it to victory in overthrowing the president, but did not go beyond that into trying to change more radically the social, economic, and political structure of the country. But at least you had a leadership of the uprising, and that's why it was successful in Tunisia. In Egypt, the second state where they toppled the president, that was the army. Again, the army. It's not like in Tunisia. It was very clearly a coup that happened there. Now, the question of the leadership is crucial here because, you know, despite all the comments on Facebook revolution and I don't know what, and leaderless revolution, you don't have leaderless revolution. In order to change social, economic, and for a whole system, you need an organized force. You need an organized opposition, strong enough to lead this change. And that was what was lacking, because in most countries, what you had was movements that were started by coalitions of left-wing and liberal groups and parties, generally weak, but they used the mass media and other, the social media and other such means, and they managed to start a big uprising. But then the Islamic fundamentalist movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, came into the picture, and everywhere they jumped into the wagon because they were in the opposition in all these countries, except Bahrain, but that's a different story. There it stopped very early. In all other countries, they jumped into the wagon and tried to hijack the movement, to recuperate it. And where you had elections in Tunisia and Egypt, they were, because they had superior means, including Qatar's and Al Jazeera and all that, and Turkey's, Erdogan's support, they had advantages over the rest of the opposition. They managed to win the first elections. Now, if we look at the issue from that angle, we see here a big contrast between Algeria and Sudan. Algeria, again, is another case of lack of leadership. So it's a very big movement and all that. The lack of leadership is even beyond anything we have seen in the region. That is, the country where at the beginning the leadership was the most horizontal was Syria, where at the beginning, the first initial stage, the movement was led by local committees, using Facebook and all that to coordinate. But at least you had coordination of committees. This even is not there in Algeria. So it's a big movement. People know what they want, so they won't stop going in the street before they get something convincing as a civilian government. But there is no recognized leadership. There's no group of people. Some opposition parties tried to meet, but none of them could say, we are the leadership of the movement. they can't. And that's a big weakness. It's not a strength. That's a big weakness. That allows the military to continue, controlling the movement. And ultimately, what the military are betting on in Algeria is for the movement to stop by exhaustion, if you want. And they are trying to organize elections. And you have this paradox. You have this paradox in most countries. The military want to organize election very quickly, and the mass movement doesn't want. You can't understand that with, kind of classical thing. Who are the Democrats? But no, people are not fooled. They don't want elections. In Algeria, they don't want elections just within reproducing the same system. They know they are fake elections, fake democracy. They want a real one. They want a real civilian. They want the army to get off political power. In Sudan also they want the same. But there is a big difference here. It's the most advanced case of organization of the opposition we have seen in the region. In Sudan, you have a recognized leadership of the movement. This is called the Forces for the Declaration of Freedom and Change, FDFC. This is a coalition of, it was started by the dynamo of all that, which is the Sudanese Professional Association, which is an underground organization that was created by doctors, lawyers, and journalists at the beginning, 3 years ago. And it was underground. They started, trying to organize the struggle against Omar al-Bashir, the social struggle. And now it's much larger, and a lot of workers' unions, labor unions, rail workers, whatever, joined, and you have a big organization, social organization that is there, very big, plus opposition parties, parties of the opposition, from the Communist Party, which is the most important Communist Party in the Arab world, from the Communist Party to a party that is Sufi liberal, liberal Sufi party, the Hezbollah party. So you have a vast spectrum. Then you have some of the ethnic armed struggle groups in Darfur, in the south of the country. And then you have feminist groups. You have 2 feminist groups in this coalition. And actually this translated in a program for the coalition that is more advanced than anything else that we have seen, including on women, the women issue. So in Sudan we have a leadership. There is a leadership, and an advanced one, that which is behaving with a lot of political astuteness. And that's why also you have so much attention on Sudan by the Gulf countries and all that. They're very much afraid of what's going on there. Now, the issue is that even with a good leadership, that's not enough, of course, to it. The problem is not easy to dislodge a military dictatorship. And this is a military dictatorship. So the crucial point is whether they have enough impact on the army or not. That's the crucial point. Because if, as the military leadership feels that they can safely use the troops to crush the movement, or use the special forces to crush the movement, and without having problems in the rest of the army, they will carry on. But they are not sure of that. That's the limitation. They started a crackdown in earlier this month, 3rd of June. You heard of it, of course, in the news and all that. One of the results was one of the military commanders resigned in protest. So you can see that in the army there are differences, and that's one key issue, that is whether the opposition has enough of such influence or not. That will determine the things, and that will determine how the army leaders function. So for now, it's going on. It can end both ways, in a victory of the opposition or in the opposition being crushed. As I said, it's not written in the sky, so these are ongoing struggles. But it's a very interesting experience that we have seen until now, and it shows you also that, like in all long-term processes, evolutionary processes, they are cumulative, and they are a learning process. That is, people take into account the previous experiences. And we see that very clearly in the Sudan and Nigeria. They did not fall in the trap in which the mass movement fell in Egypt in 2011 and again 2013, of believing that the army will democratize the country. This is not an illusion that you will find today in Nigeria or in Sudan. And a final point connected to that, which helped in that, is that in Sudan alone, there is no way for the Islamic fundamentalist movement to portray themselves as part of the opposition, because they were part of the regime. What you had in Sudan is a military dictatorship connected with the Muslim Brotherhood and other such Islamic fundamentalists. And that was actually the only country where you had, aside from the Saudi kingdoms, which is a different story, but the only country with an Islamic fundamentalist regime was Sudan. So the opposition is, as I said, I mean, the more moderate, between quote marks, in the opposition are a liberal Sufi leadership party, which is not at all a fundamentalist organization. So that's another strength of this movement in Sudan, is that they are facing, I mean, there is no way for what contributed to the defeat of the first phase in many countries was when the Muslim Brotherhood got into the picture, and then instead of a struggle between revolution and counter-revolution, it became a struggle between two counter-revolutionary forces, the old regime and the Islamic fundamentalists. And the progressive were marginalized. That was a major defeat for the movement. Now in Sudan, the situation is completely different. That's why it's an important one. Again, I mean, of course, we can hope for the better, but it's far from being certain, unfortunately. So we'll have to see. In any event, whether we have a victory, which will accelerate things, or a defeat, which will delay even more things. In Sudan, the region, as I said, won't get out of this turmoil. There will not be any new long period of stability in the region. Anyone believing this are just dreaming. The region won't stabilize unless it undergoes this radical structural change that I mentioned at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. That was very good. So now let's a short break, 5 minutes, and then questions and comments. Rob?
Well,
Thank you, Julian.
first of all, I would like to thank you because it was extremely important that you put it, the practicalities of the issue, how to sort it out, which is rare actually. You didn't only give us the facts, you also show the solution, which is very important. And my question is, there is a neoliberal economy in the entire world. That's number one. Number two, because of the liberal economy, there is a more strong hand-in-glove relationship between the nations. Europe, America, and for example, you mentioned about the Bahrain uprising is crushed because of Saudi Arabia Brotherhood support. This sort of things seem to me is more bold now. I really would like to know, compared with the 1950s, 60s, 70s, what level of international cooperation from the counter-revolutionary point I'm asking, how we are going to face that? At the same time, they are equipped with the new technology. I mean, we are sort of saying to ourselves, oh, we have social media, etc. But they have more better killing apparatus. When your demonstration before, we never had the gas bomb, the hyperbole spread in your face and things like that. And now worse, and people may not like to go out and demonstrate, but this kind of that they are demonstrating. And you also mentioned about the leadership, the absence of leadership. How they are going to do that? I mean, up till now, what we learned, strong party relationship. It can be legal or illegal, doesn't it? Underground parties or parties that they are known.
Shall we?
I think
Let me
these
answer
are
this
the major
question.
questions that I would like to hear more about it. And also, in the area, I want to have a little bit of more discussion on Syria's position and the position of Iran, now what is going to happen between America and Iran, and of course the Russia's involvement as a third party. Thank you.
Thank you, Emar.
Only this.
Let him answer this and then we take some. Would you like to answer this?
Okay.
Before we start.
We need 40 more minutes.
We have exactly 40 more minutes. Exactly.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief. These are, of course, very big topics, and thank you for bringing them in. Yeah, you're absolutely right about the what's called globalization. You didn't use the term, but you were basically referring to that term, which, but I don't think that it's globalization that changes something in this regard. That is, for instance, the intervention of Saudi Kingdom and Bahrain would have happened 50 years ago or now, it would be the same. That is, Bahrain, if you look at the map, is just a small, very small island connected to the Saudi Kingdom by a bridge, actually, a long bridge, and they can't, the Saudis can't tolerate any overthrow of any of the monarchies around them. So this, and you know, foreign intervention are not new. The United States intervened into so many countries since the Second World War to crush revolutions or progressive movements. But where there is something important, there you're definitely right, is in the technology, of course. The technologies today are far more advanced than what you had a few decades ago. But this goes both ways. That is, the regimes and all that have more means of surveillance and all these things. It's much more difficult today to be underground and wage a normal kind of struggle. Can be underground in a terrorist group. Even that has its limitations. On the other hand, technology is also used by the movements. We spoke of social media, we spoke of Facebook, Twitter, and all that. And one of the first things now that the regime are doing in the region is to shut the internet. In both Algeria and Sudan, they shut the internet. In Egypt, when it started, Mubarak shut the internet. The phone also, the mobile phones and all that. So these regimes understand that this is also used as a weapon against them. So it is double-edged. But of course, it is a big challenge. At the same time, the spread of information is much faster than whatever you had before, and that's to the benefit of the revolutions, actually, because people can see, they can even see, not only here. I mean, something like what you had in Tahrir Square, everybody followed live on television. If you go back 50 years before that, people would read about it in the newspaper the next day. That's a major difference. Or hear about what's going on the radio. You before television even existed. So all these are really, I mean, I would say it's difficult to say in the balance who's more profiting. Probably I would say the mass movement is taking better advantage of the technological communication developments. But the key point remains indeed this issue of the leadership. It's a very old issue, hasn't been solved. And there, because of these technological changes, I think, you can also have changes in the types of leadership. That is the idea that you could have in the past century of the leading party, which is centralized and all that. I think this is basically today no longer working. Yeah? What you have are much more, I mean, if you take the resurgence, for instance, of radical youth movements in Europe or in the United States, the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, or Corbyn in this country, the Labour Party and all that, these are, let's say, much looser kind of organization than the kind of party conception that you had in the past. And that's what now you could, I mean, where you can place your hopes for change. In the global south, and especially where you have repressive countries and all that, again, the technologies that you mentioned make it difficult to build a kind of centralized underground party. That's very difficult. But the technologies make it much easier to build a vast, network kind of movement. That's what we have now, more and more. Like in Sudan, I said, you have a few parties, but the major driving force is the Sudanese Professional Association. It's a very horizontal kind of professional labor combined kind of movement, and it's very, if you look at their website, you have all the time communiques by the workers here, the rail workers there, the port workers there, the factory this, or the hospital workers, or it's a whole organization of the workers, the society, the real society, at a level which was much more difficult to achieve earlier. So they used the technologies. That's why the military cut the internet when they started the repression. And also it's more coalitions. You have coalitions working. No longer just one single party, the leader or whatever. It's more working in coalitions. This is the changes that we can see, but it's early to say what is the final shape, if you want, the kind of revolutions we'll see. But the experiences in the Arab world give a clue to this 21st century revolutionary tradition, a new one. Syria, Iran, and Russia, these are very big topics. Well, Syria, I mean, it's exactly the same as everywhere else, that is social economic blockage and worse dictatorship than in most other countries. It's really a very repressive dictatorship. Much more than what you had, for instance, in Egypt under Mubarak. It was liberal compared to Syria. You could have opposition, you could have anything. In Syria, you couldn't. I myself have a lot of friends who spent 15, 16, 17 years in jail. Without any, not because they did anything violent or anything, just because they were communists or whatever. So so the explosion came very naturally when people saw in other countries what's happening. They got emboldened. And in the beginning, they were mostly young people and all that, and on democratic and secular slogans and all that. What happened is, after a few months and the movement rising and all that, Turkey and Qatar, with the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, basically hijacked the movement, the leadership of the movement. They formed this National Council in Istanbul, which proclaimed itself the leadership. Unfortunately, those in the country, the committees, accepted that. That is the major turning point, which will lead to what happened later. And later we got into a competition between Gulf countries, between Qatar with Erdogan and the Saudis and all that, each trying to hijack the opposition. So, because the Gulf countries, they are as much afraid of a democratic revolution in Syria as the Syrian regime is. So, but they can't support the Syrian regime for sectarian reasons, because the Saudis and all that, you know, they are Sunni fundamentalists, and okay, they see that, well, this is a Sunni uprising against Alawi. Yeah, that's how they see it. Although the Syrian society the Sunnis were split. It's not the Alawi and the Sunnis, but that's a different story. What they did was precisely to try to transform the opposition from democratic to sectarian Sunni and Islamic fundamentalist. And in that way, that is safe for them. That's not a threat for them. It's a threat if it's a democratic secular movement. And they managed, by competition, all that. At some point, you can read books on Syria, they'll tell you, at some point, you know, people needed to live. The country was in a big turmoil, and it went there like this for many months, so no more salaries, no more something. The only way to get money was to grow your bird and, you know, Allahu Akbar and things like that. That's where you could get money, and that's how they favored the development of Islamic fundamentalist groups. And Iran entered, I mean, despite all that, the regime lost ground. It fell when Iran entered, it was to rescue the regime. And so Iran is also an Islamic fundamentalist regime. So what you have is this, so this was a complete degeneration after 2013, basically, with the Iran intervention and the Islamization of the opposition on the other hand. This whole, what began as a revolutionary process, turned into what I said at the end of my talk when I mentioned how in many countries the hijacking by Islamic fundamentalist forces of the movement led to this shift from revolution, counter-revolution, to a clash between counter-revolutionary forces. And that's what you had in Syria, with one side backed by or funded by the Gulf and Erdogan, and another side backed by Iran, and then Russia that get in. Russia, I mean, the present day Russia is a major reactionary power. I mean, this is not the Soviet Union. This is the exact contrary from that regard. It's a completely reactionary power, which is very proud. I mean, just today, Putin gave an interview to Financial Times saying, your liberalism is dead. He's not speaking of economic liberalism, because that in Russia is much worse than even in the United States. He's speaking of political liberalism. He's just saying nationalism, authoritarianism, that's the real thing. In that sense, he's much closer to Erdogan. That's why they're good friends now, than to anything. So Russia actually is playing, first he gambled. When Putin started intervening, he started intervening in September 2015. At that point, the regime, despite Iran and Hezbollah and all that intervening, the regime was losing again. Why? Because the main advantage of the regime was it was the only to have air power. And that was helped by the position of the United States. The United States refused to give anti-aircraft weapons to the opposition. So this allowed Assad to control the sky. But his means were limited in that regard. So, and he started losing ground, and Iran doesn't have air force. You cannot send air force to Syria. That's where he needed Russia. So Russia, I mean, Putin studied the situation. He's a chess player, you know. And he saw that, well, he had invaded Crimea, and next to Crimea, he had all these problems there, and he wanted to stay there, but he had sanctions from the Western countries. When he saw the rise of ISIS, then the wave of refugees that went into Europe, even Erdogan took advantage of that and got some money from Merkel and all that to stop this influx of refugees. Putin also thought of using the same card. So if I control Syria, then I control a major card in my hand, so I can ask Western countries to accept my annexation of Crimea, remove the sanctions, and I mean, this is a strong card in his hand, and now he's showing it in his even in the interview I mentioned, or now we'll see what he will what happens in the meeting with Trump. Anyway, his calculation was to intervene. At the beginning, he made it cautiously. So after 2 months, he said, "Mission accomplished. We are withdrawing." It was just tentative, but he remained, and now he's fully engaged. And he recently had a meeting in Israel between Israelis, Americans, and Russians. How to divide the spot. So basically, the card that he is playing is, unlike the United States, he is telling dictatorships in the region, "You can rely on me. I don't have a problem supporting dictatorships. I don't have a problem selling you arms and all that. So I don't have the Congress and I don't know what behind me, opposition or whatever." So that's the role he's playing. He's playing, this is the card he's playing. It has no color because he's very strong relation with Sisi in Egypt, with the United Arab Emirates. He intervened with the United Arab Emirates and Sisi in Libya in support of this guy Haftar, this former CIA guy, this general. So he's playing a very reactionary card in the region. He supported Bashir, and then he supports the military council. Russia is very clear because I would say the opposition is very democratic there. It's left-wing also, the general platform of the opposition. So it is because Russia today is a very reactionary country. I mean, the clash between the United States and Russia today is not one between systems, it's one between reactionary powers fighting to control the world. That's like an inter-imperialist struggle. It's no longer something else.
Thank you. Your question.
It's a very good, very comprehensive lecture. Just you mentioned there's the social movements are made up of young, unemployed feminist elements within the movement. There's just a cut to the chase. Are we dealing with a weakening of a neo-caliphate to where a predominant Arab elite is losing political power over a young, multi-ethnic, liberalised population? Because in Sudan it wasn't just a young Arab people that were cut across different ethnic groups like the Nubian, and also, I don't know much about North Africa or East Africa. And in the Marxist terms, with Asia and the global South heavily reliant on neoliberalism to finance their nation states, I disagree with you that liberalism is not, liberal values will not solve the endemic infrastructure bureaucratic problems after revolution. Because because most young people want to have jobs, buy big houses, get their Sky TV or whatever, have what the ruling elite would like. So are you sort of creating more of a problem especially when, like the especially when Russia is no longer the Soviet Union, and there is no global desire for that kind of revolution?
Thank you. Maybe we should get a few more and then you can answer. Any other questions from here? Mustafa?
Thank you very much for the lecture. I really benefited. You mentioned Atlantic to Gulf. There are another 4 countries: Morocco, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. We didn't see that kind. They have same issues. Neoliberalism is affecting. We have same issues to young youth. Is the demographically is much more than the old people. And austerity measures were there, but we didn't see any in the sense of other countries uprising in those countries.
Okay. Maybe one more question. Okay, Nick?
I thought it was a very interesting talk. The situation described of block development across the region as a whole. What do you think is the way through them? What political forces? First of all, what kind of, would you say, you gave what seemed to me to be a class analysis of the forces and the nature of the regimes there. What kind of forces, well, you gave an analysis of the forces in play. Which of those are going to be most important, do you think? Will the working class, the organised working class, for instance, can that play the more significant role? And what kind of programme can break, not only in terms of engaging in a political struggle which overthrows the types of regimes you have there, but has the possibility of actually overcoming the block development that you have? If this is a crisis that is going to continue for years and perhaps decades ahead, do you have any foresight as to what the eventual solution might be in terms of a progressive outcome there?
Maybe you should answer these and then see if
Okay.
we have more time.
Okay, thank you Ian, for the questions, comments. I'll take them in the order of what were said. Yes, Sudan is a multi-ethnic country, definitely. There was even forced Arabization of the country under successive regimes. And we have had a lot of these forced Arabization in North Africa and also in the Middle East towards the Kurds and the rest. You had such phenomena, historical processes happening. But this issue is came to the fore only in Algeria now because they were raising, part of the movement were raising the Amazigh, which are called the Berbers, but the term they don't like for good reason. They prefer the term Amazigh. So this flag has been banned now by the military, and they repressed the last demonstration. They repressed everyone. They tried to arrest everyone holding this flag. That's one of the issues that any deep, real democratic change in the region will have to face. Is democratization is also allowing to other. Allowing other languages and all that to develop and let the people choose freely what they want at this level. I didn't say that liberalism would, I mean, if that's what you meant or what you understood from what I said, I didn't say that liberalism would solve the problem. I don't remember having said anything like this. But of course, political liberalization is part of political democratization, and that's one of the major demands of the mass movement, and it's a very just and progressive demand. But alone, of course, as I said, pointing to Tunisia, I said clearly, I think that Tunisia democratized the regime, but that does not solve the problem, which is social and economic, and for which, therefore, you need other things. Maybe I can come to that, and then I will get back to the other, to precisely what you were saying about the program and all that. The program, I mean, what you need is this region is a region where this blockage, this social economic blockage that I mentioned, is the product of neoliberal changes, betting on the private sector and pushing back the state from any developmentalist role. This was a total failure because there are no conditions for a private sector in the region to play the role of the driving force in development. It's not even like Turkey, where the middle and small enterprises and all that played a key role, and Turkey had already industrial infrastructure. Shouldn't forget that it was an imperial state originally, and the other states were dominated by Turkey, so they were kind of colonial, under a kind of colonial relation. You had, and also the opening of the European market boosted the development of a country like Turkey with a key role of the private sector. This is not reproduced in the region. We have nothing like that, and there are no conditions under this heavy control by states of everything, and no conditions for that, and that's what led to the social economic crisis. So in order to get out of that, what you need is a radical change in the economic policies, with the state playing a key role in development. That means the public sector should be the driving force of the development, and in a condition, especially in a condition where any reliance on the private sector is doomed to fail. That's the key point, I would say, in any alternative economic policy to what exists. What's the social composition of change? It is very much what we can see in these countries. That is, we see a vast coalition of workers, professionals, students, and workers in the broad sense. I mean, we're not speaking of factory workers, but all wage earners and all that, all these workers in transport and health and education and all that. That's the social mass, the social constituency of the revolutionary change in the region. To come to what you were saying, no, the old countries had major, as I said, in 8 countries until now you had uprisings, but all countries saw a big rise in the social struggle. And Morocco in 2011 already had a major wave. A big movement was created and remained ongoing for several months until the monarchy managed to weaken it by one of the things the monarchy did was to co-opt in government the Basel Brotherhood, But again, a few years later, you had a new last year, and in 2017, that you had a very strong movement, and it's going on. So you have country is in a state of permanent agitation. Jordan last year had a major big movement which toppled, which led to a government resigning, a change of government and all that. And you have had, since 2011, a lot of waves of demonstrations and all that. Lebanon too, there was a beginning of a movement. You have every now and then, but in Lebanon the problem is the sectarian issue, which which hampers the development of a trans-sectarian horizontal social movement. These divisions are in such a way that every time you have some beginning of movement, they manage to recapture that into turning it into beware of the Shia, the Sunni, the Maronites. So, that's the main stumbling block in Lebanon. We can hope that one day a mass movement will be able to overcome this, but for the time being, this is effective. That's it. But no, yes, not a single country except Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Everywhere else, including Kuwait, you had some movement in 2011. Okay, still also, but Bahrain is one of the main uprisings. Oman had a major, the Sultanate of Oman, major mass movement. Not an uprising, but a mass struggle. You had movements in the eastern province of the Saudi kingdom, but they were strongly crushed. So we can see that this is really a wave that shook the whole region.
Thank you. Maybe a couple more questions? There's Alan here.
I find this enormously inspiring, but I have a particular question which you have addressed only briefly, and it is the transformation of democracy, or the transformation of social relations in a historical context related to the development of the industry, or whatever you call it.
Technology.
And the thing is, the Soviet Revolution was based on a class division between property and labor, and so were the democracies who opposed the Soviet system. Were also based on the division between bourgeoisie and proletariat as political parties in the democracy. So the democracy was a capitalist democracy. And now, you're quite right, what we are seeing now is not this class division anymore. It's a very divided, coherent process of upheaval. And I don't see the classical democracy as something which can be imagined as a solution of a state which reconciles these divisions. That is my point. There is a social process of change in the production process which doesn't allow anymore the same democracy as we had previously, and we know all the democracies are in crises almost. Anyway, I wanted to address this process, which obviously the Middle East plays the role of an advanced movement.
Thank you. Have your question?
Yeah. Thank you for your very interesting lecture. I think I've really learned so much from it because I'm not very familiar with all this politics in that region. And it's also very interesting to see that you published this book, Morbid Symptoms, Relapsing the Arab Uprising in 2016. And it's now, recently, it's happening again in Tunisia. I'm just you can see, seems as though it's like you could predict that it's going to happen before it happened. So are you hopeful that they could this time succeed? You know, you said that there was a little bit of organization between them. Will they be able to succeed or not?
Thank you.
This time.
This.
Okay, thank you very much again. I mean well, first I don't think that the class division is obsolete. It's still very much there, except that the form of the class itself is something different. The Russian Revolution is one in which you had very much an industrial working class playing the vanguard role. And it is on this industrial working class that the Bolshevik Party was essentially based. I think for a lot of reasons, this kind of situation cannot be repeated in this Russian form, where you had this very clear demarcation between the workers and all that. And in cities, actually, if you read one of the classic analysis of that, the history of the Russian Revolution by Leon Trotsky, he mentioned this issue very clearly, that the Russian cities were cities with very little petite bourgeoisie or other classes. So you had the working class that developed with industrialization on the outskirts and all that of the cities, and you had the bourgeoisie, but you didn't have much in between. Whereas the historical process, that's where probably the issue on which Marx's the predictions by Marx were, let's say, did not prove accurate. It is that although you have a polarization of property between the owners and the rest, yes, but you have a reproduction and a development and changes in the form of those intermediary layers and small businesses and all that. This has carried on developing. Now, also you have to take working class today, I mean, in our societies, is whether advanced or like what you have in the region. It's no longer the industrial working class. It's the working class in a much more general term of all the. I mean, when you say proletariat, already the term proletariat is much larger, because proletariat is everyone obliged to sell their labor force to live, and that involves a huge lot of people. Okay, all the wage earners basically. In that sense, yes, that's. I mean, and that division between wage earners and between capitalists is very much there. It's still the driving force of social and historical change. And it is also the case in the region. Now, you're right, absolutely, about the crisis of democracy in Western countries. But I mean, even there, the issue is the real crisis of democracy is not a matter of technology or whatever. It's the problem of what is offered. So electoral participation is depends very much on what is on offer. When what is on offer are two of the same, when you have Blair versus conservatives, and they are both Thatcherites in various forms, people, the participation rate goes down very heavily. When you have a Corbyn, and it will go up, because people see that their vote becomes meaningful. So it depends on what is on offer. Every time, you can see in a lot of countries, when there is a vote that changes something, and people believe that their vote can change, they go vote. When they see, well, they are all the same, they don't vote. They don't waste their time because they don't believe that this will change anything. So that's the key point. So it's not a matter of whatever. I think the key issue is what led to this crisis of democracy is the fact that the left went down historically since for the last 2-3 decades. Social democracy shifted to the right, very much became neoliberal. The communist movement collapsed or got very much weakened, and therefore people found themselves in an opposition between a pseudo-left and the right, but which looked very much alike, and that led to this decline in electoral participation that is called the crisis of democracy. Every experience when we see people have really the feeling that there's something they can change by their vote, they go vote. That's important. And we can deepen democracy, of course, with the new technologies and all that, the levels of information of people can be deepened at the same time, of course, but that's not new. Since the invention of television and radio, demagogy also is very easy. And we have these demagogues, so we see, I mean, populism is made easier by this kind of communication, but you can bet on the intelligence of people, and especially the young generation. Most cases, you can see that the young generation are rather on the good side, I would say, of political values, and that's promising for the future, despite all the awful things that we see today with this major push of the far right and all that. I think this, okay, we are living in a kind of reactionary phase, which can be compared to what happened between the 2 world wars last century, but I don't think it will last for long. And we can see already the reversal of that in some cases. So the key issue is whether there is a new progressive left alternative to the system that emerges or not. That's the key issue. That if you have this, this can, so whereas if this is not there, then you will have more and more morbid symptoms like far right and other such of movements. Sorry. Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, it's when one understands that what is the real root of the movement, one understands, therefore, that cannot stop unless this is solved. And since this hasn't been solved anywhere in the region, that means it will carry on. That means you don't need to read in the coffee or whatever, or the crystal ball, to understand that there will be new upheavals and new explosions. And so I don't pretend to be a prophet or anything like this. I mean, as a Marxist as I am, I use these tools in analyzing the thing. And through that kind of analysis, I could say that this is going on. So without making any predictions about the outcome, what I can say is what is the problem. And when you define the problem, you know that unless it is solved, it will carry on like this, and you will have new explosions. What are the reasons? Can it succeed? To be frank with you, I would say the odds are not that high. I mean, it's very difficult for revolutionary change to succeed in this part of the world because of the curse represented by oil. As long as you have oil and gas and all that, there's such big strategic interest that global powers are very much focused on that. Whether Russia or the United States, as I said, both of them can play the role of counter-revolutionary forces. And the regimes are very fierce in defending their privileges, their all that. So it's, I mean, that's why I said, I mean, when 2011, people were telling me you're a pessimist. I was saying, look, don't, I mean, it's great that Mubarak is out, this guy is out, but the real problems have not been solved. And don't believe that it will be easy in all countries to remove the presidents and all. In some countries it will. I said that before it starts in Syria and Libya. I said when it will start in those countries, it will be bloody because the regimes are different. They will immediately try to crush the movement. So it is very difficult. That's why the Sudanese experience is very important now, because there you have a leadership which knows what they are doing, and they are really now, which day you are? Yeah. On Sunday, we are Friday. Yeah, on Sunday, that we'll have to see. But the opposition is preparing a major demonstration on Sunday. This is a test of force that will be. We'll see what happens. But so they know what they do, and basically each side is trying to split the other side. So the military are trying to split the opposition and split between the moderate parts and the rest. And the opposition is trying to split the armed forces and all that. So who manages to weaken, to split, to paralyze the other? That's what will be decisive. It is very difficult, but it's not impossible. As I said at the end of my latest book, this Morbid Symptoms, there is no ground for optimism in the region, but there is ground for hope. It's not the same. Optimism is when you are convinced that the best will happen. I mean, hope is to acknowledge that there is the potential, but it's not certain. Yeah? It's a matter of, it's an open matter, so it's a struggle.
Thank you very much.
Sure.